Hey guys, welcome back. Really quick before I start, I wanted to let you guys know about some of the supplies I use. The tape is the 3M multi-purpose painter's tape, or some people call it blue Scotch tape. And you can pretty much find it in any hardware store or even online. I usually buy mine online. And the sketchbook is a Moleskine watercolor album or watercolor sketchbook, and it's the large size, which is a 5 by 8 inch or around there. So, and my gouache is Holbein Artist Gouache. It's not acrylic gouache, so it's like the standard gouache. And for this particular painting, I also used a Winsor Newton white. So I'm slowly replacing the colors that I'm running out of, and I decided I'm going to try different brands. So you might start seeing me use other ones, especially Winsor Newton, because I like those so far. So another little announcement I have, if you've been following my channel, you know that my last post was an unboxing and review for a watercolor kit for beginners, and I was able to do 2 giveaways. So if you haven't checked already, go back to that last video and look at the comments, and if you won, I replied to your comment. And I also pinned a comment at the top that says the winners' names. So what I need you to do is email me, and I'll put the information in those comments in case you haven't seen it yet, and you can we can work out how I'll send you the kits. I was pretty overwhelmed with the response of I didn't realize that many people were into it, or I guess giveaways bring everyone out of the woodwork, right? But thank you all so much for the comments. A lot of the comments were really kind, and yeah, maybe in the future we'll be able to do more things like that. And for today's painting session, I'm starting off with a beach scene at sunset, and it's not something I do very often. Painting with the sunset colors is really tricky. So as you can see, I'm laying down like a thin wash in the background for the sky, and then slowly adding in the more colorful tones in the foreground, like on the water. And my strategy was to lay down those more colorful tones and then come back later with a second layer and kind of like mute them a little bit. But since I'm not like an expert at painting painting sunset scenes, I wasn't sure if that would work. So it was a gamble. Sometimes it is really difficult to layer subtle colors on top of each other with gouache. So much of that involves like pre-mixing the exact right color and then laying it into the scene. And even as you do that, like it's going to mix with the colors underneath it, so it's going to alter it a little bit. So it's really tricky. In my live streams, when I'm doing gouache painting, I get a lot of questions about my process. So I'll try to give you guys like a couple quick, just easy tips that helps the gouache experience. As I'm painting here, it's real time, so I wanted you guys to be able to see like the exact process that I do. A lot of times I mix my color, I apply it to the paper, and then I immediately wash my brush off and touch it onto my damp paper towel. And that does 2 things. It clears the paint off the brush, obviously, and then it when I dab it on the paper towel, it allows me to control like the exact amount of water that's on the brush, because I don't want it to be totally dry when I touch the paint. I want it to be just like a tiny bit moist. That way the paint will flow more smoothly off the brush, and you're less likely to end up with streaks or like rough places on the paper where the paper's showing through because the paint wasn't flowing enough. Does that make sense? So if you find that your brush is the paint isn't like coming off the brush very easily, and you're trying to do those thin layers especially, it probably means that your brush just isn't quite wet enough. But be careful, because if you do too much water, you're just gonna end up with like a big goopy mess. So it is a really fine line. That water control is much more difficult than with watercolor, because gouache reacts very differently to the water. But that's honestly just something that comes with practice. I mean, I know you're probably sick of me saying that, and every artist says, like, it's just practice. But it's true, especially with water control, because no one can tell you exactly how much water to use. That literally only happens in your particular case, in that particular painting. So, yeah, just keep going. And if it turns out to be a hot mess, I guarantee that you learned something. Another little trick that I've learned is to start off with very thin layers and work your way up to the thicker final layers. One of the unique properties of gouache is that you can always come back and reactivate it. Unless you're using acrylic gouache, obviously, that's permanent, but standard artist gouache has the ability to be reactivated, and you can continue to blend into it in the future. So that can be tricky when you don't finish your whole painting in one layer. If you need multiple layers, like I do, then you have to be aware that every following layer, every layer that you go on top, is going to blend into the previous layer, which you can use to your advantage at times. For instance, if you want to get a green color, but you don't have green, like me, you're using primary colors to mix all your colors, you can lay down a thin wash of maybe blue and then come back in with a yellow and start touching in the yellow into that blue, and it's going to slowly blend into green. So you can do that, or you can pre-mix your green and then apply it to the paper. So it just depends on like what look you're going for. But regarding the layering, it can be a little bit tricky when you aren't quite sure about your colors. So like for instance, in this painting, I am doing the sunset ocean scene. I started off with my bright, more colorful layer, and then I'm now coming back in with the darker, more muted tones. And I'm trying to like neutralize it a little bit and also paint in the shadows of the waves and the reflections or anything else that's going on. And while doing that, my paint is now mixing with that first more colorful layer and changing the color that I'm applying. So, you know, you have to be strategic in a way when you're doing that and think about that from the very beginning. But I found that even though that can be a little tricky, it's still much easier than painting super thick from the beginning and trying to do like everything in the first layer. So that's just a strategy that I've learned to use, and I know it might not work for everyone or be everyone's preferred method, but if you're having trouble with layering gouache, maybe try it like this. Maybe try starting with your very first layer being really thin and then slowly building up the thickness. I always try to leave the really thick highlight areas for the very end of the painting. Like if it's maybe sun glistening off water or whatever, or light falling through the trees, just like let that little thick dab of white paint be the last thing, because it's actually really easy to get your white all muddied up. So having it be the final thing that you're not going to touch anymore, just like layering it thick on the paper, usually works a little better for me. Another tip is if you're using more of like an impressionist style paint technique, I mean, if you're going classic impressionist, there's like specific rules you would do, like only do vertical brush strokes and layer colors. Don't layer colors, but actually place colors next to each other, blah, blah, blah. But if you are just going for that general, more impressionist style or look, then one thing you can do is instead of blending like literally everything in the painting, you can just try to place bigger chunks of color next to each other. And I definitely have seen a lot of amazing artists do this technique, especially concept artists who do environment painting. Like Nathan Fowkes is a really great example, and Mike Hernandez, who goes by like Gouache online, I think. They have a lot of paintings where you can actually see like the individual colors next to each other, but when you like back up a little bit, the whole painting comes together and just looks gorgeous. And that's a totally different strategy than this. So there's definitely more than one way to do it, and maybe experiment with the different ways and find which one is more natural to you. I'm actually currently trying to practice doing that a little bit more. Like layering is great, but I also love the look when you're kind of placing colors next to each other and letting the viewer's eye do more of the work. So perhaps you would call it more of a broken color technique, and it just has a totally different look to it. I think it's really magical, especially for studies, because you usually have much less time when you're doing a study, especially outside. And that kind of technique really lends itself well to that doing plein air paintings, doing quick paintings. This painting was timed for 15 minutes, so I wasn't letting myself get too carried away. But like, I remember thinking at this point in the painting, I was a little frustrated because it wasn't turning out how I had hoped. But I stuck with it, and I decided, like, I'm just going to finish it and have something on the paper. And either way, I had already learned a lot at this point. So despite the struggles, like, try to think of something positive that you're getting from each painting, whether it's just like one single thing or many things. It will definitely keep you encouraged. In this particular case, my biggest lesson learned was color mixing. Honestly, like, I was trying to layer and mix my colors first and then layer it on the paper appropriately, but as I was building up the layers, I kept noticing, like, oh, I should have done this color more bright, or oh, I should have done this color more dark, blah, blah, blah. And that gets really frustrating after a while. So again, it's all lessons learned. In like retrospect, you see a lot of things that you did wrong. So now I know for the next time I do a sunset painting, I should maybe go a little more bold with the initial color and then come back in and layer in like the more neutral colors on top of it, and it'll pop a little bit more, because overall this painting seemed a little too dull to me. In my mind, it was supposed to be like this bright sunset scene, and it ended up being more like a really chill dusk scene without much color. But yeah, I still learned a ton, so I was happy in the end. Happy, quotation marks. There's not really a shortcut to amazing painting. So even though it can feel kind of crappy thinking about all the things you're doing wrong, that is definitely a way that you're going to grow faster. So taking an active role in your learning, and it's basically a way of like studying smarter. That's going to help you progress so much more than just doing a million paintings over and over again and never really thinking about it and just hoping that like you're going to build muscle memory or magically understand it. Which, I mean, if that works for someone, great, but I definitely lean more towards doing something about it. Like looking at what I'm doing, thinking about it as I'm doing it, and for the next, I'm already thinking about the next painting and like how I could achieve the effect I want to achieve. So yeah, I know it can feel it can be sometimes disheartening when it's not going your way, but just try to think about the fact that you're improving slowly, step by step. Each painting is one step closer, and maybe that'll be enough encouragement to keep you going. But no matter what, don't compare yourself to others, because that's just going to depress you. And every artist has taken their own path to get to where they are, and I mean, you cannot repeat the exact same steps that someone else has done in their life. So you're on your own journey. It might take you longer, it might take you less time, who knows, but don't go down the path of like watching people do their work, watching someone else's process and comparing it to your own. Just learn from them and maybe be inspired by them, and feel free to try things that they're doing, but try to avoid the downward spiral of actually comparing yourself to them. And I know that is so much easier said than done, because I am guilty of doing that too. I compare myself to people and I have to like remind myself, stop. But yeah, this painting is pretty much done, and I was gonna do another one if you guys are cool with sticking around. I might put on a little music since I feel like I'm talking your guys' ear off. If I think of anything else to say that might help or get any other tips, I'll definitely chime in. But otherwise, I hope you guys enjoy the next painting. So this painting was a lot more straightforward. As you can see, I pretty much was just painting it in sections, so there was a lot less layering overall. I did come back in and do some like secondary, third layers for texture, as you'll see soon, but it was more about just practicing color mixing and trying to achieve that depth in the landscape. As you probably heard me mention and many other artists mention, the whole thing about atmospheric perspective, where you can use color and contrast to give the feeling of depth in a painting, in a landscape. So in the distance, things tend to be like a bit more muted and a bit more cooler colors, like blues, grayish blues, and as you get closer and closer to the viewer, you'll add more warmer tones and maybe a little more contrast and a little more detail. So that's just something that I was practicing in this painting, and not trying to do like over the top detail or anything, but just capturing a variety of textures in the grasses and the different colors of the grasses as they got closer. So it was just a really relaxing, enjoyable painting overall. And this was based on a reference photo I took last summer driving through the Highlands, and I love driving in the Highlands in the spring, especially because there's such a huge variety of colors. You get like the deep blues, the rich deep green colors, and even the bright almost like neon green tones, as well as flowers and everything else. So yeah, really beautiful landscape. I think for this one, my biggest lesson learned was even though I wasn't going for like a crazy amount of detail, I think I could have gone a little more added a little more variety of textures, especially in the background. So that background mountain was just a little too smooth for my taste. And as I got closer to the foreground, I probably could have put more time into like rendering different grasses or bushes or something like that. So yeah, overall, I really liked it, but I could have gone a little bit further. I guess that about wraps it up though. If there's anything you guys want to see next time or any other demos you want to see, please let me know. And otherwise, stay inspired, and I'll see you guys again soon.